Okay, let's look at the stomach now. Just like before, we're going to attack this in the same way. We're first going to look at the anatomy, then the functions, and then here's where we're going to start adding pathologies. With the stomach anatomy, it's worth looking at both the big picture and the small picture, so the macrostructure and the microstructure. And then we're also going to look at the functions of the stomach, along with the macrostructure and microstructure. So here's our overview first. Remember we did the same thing with the mouth? And we said that motility was movement. The mouth just chewed things and swallowed things and packed that food into a ball. We called it a bolus. Well, the stomach, once it gets a hold of that food, it'll, this nickname, can't believe I nicknamed it this way. It does peristalsis, where it kind of tosses food back and forth. So I call it rock and roll peristalsis. We don't really move the food so much in the stomach as really mix it and break it up into tiny little pieces. Now what do we secrete in the stomach? A whole lot of gastric juice. In fact, about 2 liters of gastric juice per day. And in that gastric juice we have acid, we have water, of course, and we have a whole lot of enzymes that help us in digestion. We also secrete a lot of mucus in the stomach too. That mucus is what helps protect our stomach from its own acids and its own enzymes. You have a really thick layer of mucus coating the inside of your stomach. We also have in there, and this is actually included as part of our gastric juice, hydrochloric acid, pepsin, and gastrin. Those last two, or rather, just pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme, gastrin is a hormone, and we'll see what those do in just a moment. What kind of digestion do we do here? Well, we break down our proteins, and when I say we break down, we start to break down our proteins. So we take our long chains of proteins, remember proteins are made of amino acids linked together, and we cleave those amino acids off the long chains of proteins one by one, and it's pepsin that does that. And if you remember, the way that we break up these long polymers like proteins and like starches is via a chemical reaction called hydrolysis. So I have it here as pepsin converts proteins to amino acids. You can also think of it as pepsin hydrolyzes proteins to amino acids. We also produce some lipases in there, and as the name implies, lipases will break down lipids or fats. When I say, again, break down, we're going to hydrolyze those lipids or fats into their components, and the components of fats are fatty acids. By the way, if you're following along on an older version of this, I don't have this information about lipases, so please make sure you add this in. Despite all this breaking down going on, all this mixing and rolling, we don't really absorb a whole lot here in the stomach. Really, all we absorb is alcohol and aspirin. And aspirin really technically isn't considered a food, but I list it here because maybe you know this. Aspirin can irritate our stomach if we take certain uncoated versions of it. When I say uncoated, you can get aspirin in a couple different forms. You can get it in its just raw form, where it's just aspirin packed in a little tab, or you can get it in what's called an enteric coated form. That makes it release a little bit easier, a little bit slower, so it doesn't irritate your stomach as much. And again, it irritates your stomach because that's where we absorb it. That's where we move it into the bloodstream. Okay, let's look at some stomach macrostructure. A lot going on here. Up here, where's my little mouse? There it is. Here's the esophagus. Right, that's the food tube. And at the border between the esophagus and the top of the stomach, we have our lower esophageal sphincter, or the cardiac sphincter. Remember, this is right next to the heart. In fact, the very first part of the stomach is called the cardia because of that. This is the very first part of the stomach. This bulge of the stomach right here, that's called the fundus. I love that word, fundus. And that fundus is really there. You don't really use it a whole lot except, during Thanksgiving meals. So that fundus is for extra storage of food if you really stuff yourself silly. We're going to skip the muscularis externa and the serosa just for now. This whole area right here, this is the body. And then inside the stomach, as with the inside of all hollow organs. We call it the lumen. Notice lining the inside of the stomach, we have these what are called rugae. Rugae, that's the pronunciation, although apparently it's pronounced 100 different ways. Rugae. I like rouge, it sounds French. Rouge. Anyway, rugae. These are folds of the stomach, of the inside of the stomach. They help to increase surface area of the stomach, and they help the stomach to expand and collapse when necessary. Because when your stomach is empty, it doesn't occupy much space at all. But when it's full, it'll occupy a huge amount of space. So these rugae allow it to collapse on itself when you're not eating. Further on down the stomach, we get into what's called the pyloric antrum. Pyloric antrum. And then the very bottom end is the pyloric canal. And then we hit the pyloric sphincter. Pyloris, by the way, means gatekeeper. I think in Greek, probably. Anyways, I know it means gatekeeper in some language. So why do we bother naming all these different parts of the stomach? Because you can have ulcers in different parts of the stomach, in the pyloric antrum, in the body, in the cardia, etc. Okay. By the way, the duodenum right here, this is part of the small intestine. So the stomach leads into the small intestine through the pyloric sphincter or pyloric valve. This muscularis externa stuff here, remember that's our layers of smooth muscle, and we said previously, if we go all the way back, we said that there are 2 layers of smooth muscle. Okay, did we say there were 2 layers of smooth muscle? I really hope we did. Oh, we did in the esophagus. We said there was a circular layer and then a longitudinal layer. We're actually going to follow a very similar pattern in the stomach. So we're going to have 2 layers of smooth muscle, the circular layer and the longitudinal layer, but our stomach gets an additional layer called the oblique layer. And the reason why our stomach has 3 layers of muscle instead of 2 is because our stomach does a lot of squeezing and squishing and mixing. It's actually pretty bonkers. I have a video to show you guys. You almost don't believe it when you see it. So we do need that additional layer of muscle for support. And then of course on the outside we have the serosa. Remember that serosa, if we want to get way more specific, it is the parietal, sorry, not the parietal, the visceral peritoneum. Okay. This top part of the stomach, this top curve of the stomach is called the lesser curvature. This bottom curve down here is called the greater curvature. And you're going to have different things attached to different curvatures, actually. You're going to have different mesenteries and different layers of fat attached to each of these curvatures. Here's an image of a human stomach. This has been cut open and laid flat. So we can definitely see those rugae, or rugae, on the inside right there. We can see the pyloric valve pretty clearly right here in the very beginning of the duodenum. We can kind of sort of see the lower esophageal sphincter. We kind of have to squint a little bit. And the esophagus though, wow, it's such a different color, right? So in this particular image, we've cut the stomach along the greater curvature and then just laid it flat. Okay, still on the macrostructure, still on the big stuff. Remember way back when we were studying arteries and veins, and we looked at the celiac artery? Well, here it's coming back. What supplies our stomach? It's that celiac artery. And the celiac artery branches into what are called gastric arteries, which supply the rest of the stomach. And our stomach has those 4 layers that we discussed previously, the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and the serosa. However, there's a couple modifications here. We said that we had those extra thick bands, that extra layer of muscularis externa, to help with that rock and roll peristalsis, and that was the oblique layer within the stomach. And we have 2 special sphincters, the lower esophageal sphincter and the pyloric sphincter. Oops, a little too far. So our lower esophageal sphincter is up here, the pyloric sphincter is down here, and then we have those ridges, those rouges, to allow our stomach to expand when we're eating Thanksgiving dinner. Attached to the surface of the stomach, we also have a big layer of fat and membranes. These membranes are kind of sort of like mesenteries, but they don't anchor anything. They just kind of hang down from your stomach, kind of like giant aprons. Let me actually show you a picture here to help us visualize this. So here's your stomach right there. And then this is this little green thing, that's the gallbladder, and then this is the liver. And the liver's actually been kind of lifted up so we can see more of what's going on. Normally the liver would be laying over this entire area that I just highlighted in red right there. Notice attached to the greater curvature of our stomach right there, we have this big layer of fat and membrane. That's called the greater omentum. The greater omentum. Between the stomach and the liver, we have what's called the lesser omentum. And over here, this one it's not a phenomenal picture because it's on a cadaver that's been preserved, but you can still see it pretty well. Be careful with orienting yourself with this. The head is to the right and then the feet are to the left on this. So we're looking at this sideways. Here's the liver, right there. Here's the stomach. It's pretty squished up in there. It's a small stomach in this example. Here's a little bit of the colon and small intestine down here that we can see. And hanging down from the stomach, and hiding most of the stomach in fact, we can see the greater omentum. And it is just kind of a flap that's hanging there. And in fact, you can just take the bottom edge of that greater omentum, and the bottom edge would be down here. You can actually lift it up over the stomach and over the liver. This is what happens in abdominal surgery if you need to access the intestines. The surgeons will just kind of pick up that greater omentum by the bottom edge and just flip it over your head. Okay, so that's the greater and lesser omentum, or omenta for plural. And they have a lot of fat. Again, what are their characteristics? They're fat-containing organs. They're actually a double layer. So let me, a little too far. Let me see if I can kind of draw this for us. So here's our stomach. The omenta, say the greater omentum, attaches at the bottom and it kind of hangs over our intestines. We're looking at someone from the side here. This is my really shitty drawing. I'm so sorry. I don't know if this is actually helping, but so we're looking at someone from the side. So we've cut our intestines, so all we see are these little circles. And then here's our stomach right here. The omentum kind of hangs down like a double-sided apron, like I said before. It looks a whole lot like our mesenteries, but it doesn't have the blood vessels, lymph vessels, or nerves. You can actually feel where your greater omentum ends on you, probably, if you have sufficient amounts of body fat. It's the greater omentum that kind of gives you that pot belly if you're a little overweight. And it ends right above where your pelvic bones come together, right above the pubic symphysis. So right where your genitalia start, that's where the greater omentum ends. By the way, a little fun fact about your stomach. It's about 50 mils at its emptiest and 2 liters at its fullest. It goes all the way from the bottom of your rib cage to your iliac crest. Those are your pelvic bones when it's full. That's what gives you the food baby appearance after a really big meal. So it's 2 liters of food. By the way, I know you're kind of wondering, why doesn't the stomach digest itself? Well, the answer is it does. It absolutely does. In fact, the stomach has to constantly renew itself. It has to constantly make more cells to replace those that have been digested and destroyed. In addition to making new cells, we also have that thick layer of mucus that the stomach secretes, so it does protect itself somewhat from its own acids and enzymes. Your stomach can't really get bigger either. So when you've been eating a lot and you feel like you can eat more and more and more with every meal, it's not that your stomach volume is getting bigger, it's just that your feedback pathways that are telling your brain that you're full, those have been adjusted. So when you're eating a whole lot of food over the course of a couple days, and you feel like you can pack in more and more, again, it's not because the stomach volume has increased. It is because your brain is starting to decrease its threshold for when it thinks you are full. Similarly, when you starve yourself, your stomach doesn't shrink. Your brain just resets those thresholds. Okay. So let's look at some of the microstructure here, some of the small parts here. And let me, again, show you a picture first. Hopefully this will help us a little more. So this is the mucosa of the stomach right here. And we're just taking one tiny little square of the mucosa of the stomach. In that mucosa, you have these little infoldings called gastric pits. And you have millions of these gastric pits in your stomach. They're not visible to the naked eye, but they are there. And these gastric pits will become at the bottom gastric glands. The gastric glands are full of some specialized cell types. We have at the very, very bottom, and they're highlighted here in green, what are called enteroendocrine cells. Enteroendocrine cells. As you can guess, their job is to secrete hormones. Endocrine, right? We have what are called chief cells. The name doesn't tell you anything about them, right? We'll see what they do. And then a little bit further up that gastric gland, we have what are called parietal cells. The rest of the cells in the pit and the gland are just our normal old simple columnar epithelial cells that we have all over our digestive tract. Okay, so taking a closer look at our gastric pits. Again, we said it's made of these folds of the mucosa layer, and then we have millions of them. And the job of these gastric pits is to actually secrete our gastric juice. And again, we saw this little fun fact. We secrete about 1.5 to 2 liters of gastric juice per day. It depends on how much we're eating. The more we eat, the more gastric juice we secrete. And that gastric juice is a combination of water, enzymes, hydrochloric acid, and hormones. And each of these different cell types will secrete a different component of this gastric juice. The parietal cells, and those are the blue guys right here, they kind of look like fuzzy blue pitchforks to me. So the fuzzy blue pitchforks, they're going to secrete our hydrochloric acid and a special hormone called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor. And maybe it sounds familiar, this intrinsic factor to you. If you remember back to blood clotting, we needed intrinsic factor to absorb our vitamin B so that we can make our blood clotting factors. So it's these parietal cells that allow us to absorb, that produce the intrinsic factor to allow us to absorb our vitamin B. What does the hydrochloric acid do? Well, it denatures proteins, and it kills any bacteria or any pathogens that happen to get down in there. Our chief cells, on the other hand, they're going to secrete digestive enzymes. And our chief cells are the most common cells down in these gastric pits. They're all the little purple guys over here. Our chief cells are going to namely secrete 2 major enzymes called pepsinogen and lipase. So, pepsinogen, you should probably start to think to yourself, hey, I bet you that's going to become pepsin. So pepsinogen, when it's secreted, is not active. However, when it is activated, it becomes pepsin. And pepsin is an enzyme. I know it doesn't have that ASE ending. I know, I'm sorry. It is an enzyme. It's one of the oldest enzymes known. So it kind of got named before that whole ASE nomenclature got put into place. Anyways, pepsin is responsible for breaking down proteins. It's really, really good at breaking down proteins. So pepsin, how it's made by hydrochloric acid. So one of the things that hydrochloric acid will do is it'll partially denature pepsinogen, which, weirdly enough, turns pepsinogen into pepsin and activates the pepsin. Now, pepsin is pretty much an all-purpose enzyme for breaking down proteins. It'll attack not only the proteins that you put in your stomach, but it'll also attack other pepsinogens. So as soon as you have pepsin going, well, it'll convert more pepsinogen into pepsin. So it's like a little self-perpetuating machine here. Lipases, on the other hand, they're going to break down fats. And again, when I say break down, you can also think hydrolyze. Those enteroendocrine cells, those green guys at the very bottom, they're going to secrete gastrin. That's a major, major hormone involved in digestion, and a whole bunch of other different types of hormones too. We're not going to really name or worry about those other hormones. We're just going to worry about gastrin. Okay, let's get into our functions. So we have 4 major functions of our stomach. We store food, we produce that intrinsic factor, we absorb food, and then we digest food. So digestion is its own big thing. It's on the next slide. Let's look at these first. Looking at that intrinsic factor. Remember, we need the intrinsic factor in order to absorb our vitamin B, specifically B12. And if you don't have B12, then you can't make your red, I apologize, I think it said blood clotting. Should have said red blood cells. Oops. You need vitamin B12 in order to do DNA replication, in order to make more red blood cells. One of the things that happens as you get older, along with like everything else falling apart, is you do not produce enough intrinsic factor, and as a result, you can have anemia because you don't produce enough red blood cells. And as we said before, your stomach doesn't really absorb much except alcohol and aspirin. Let's look at digestion. Your stomach does 2 major types of digestion, mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. And of the 2, the mechanical digestion is probably more important. Your stomach takes these big chunks of food and then tosses and turns and squishes them and just soaks the food in acid until it's nothing but this liquidy white substance called chyme. That's this word down here, chyme. If you're wondering what chyme looks like, you already know. Vomit is chyme. We call chyme stuff that goes into the small intestine. We call vomit stuff that comes out of the mouth. It's the same stuff, though. In terms of chemical digestion, well, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. We're not going to just secrete all these hormones and enzymes all willy-nilly, right? That'd be a waste of time. It'd be a waste of energy. So we do have to have a way to control the release of these hormones and the release of these digestive enzymes. It's all under control of this hormone, gastrin. And if we remember, what cells produce gastrin? Right there, it's those enteroendocrine cells. Again, gastrin's a hormone. Think enteroendocrine, secreting a hormone. Okay, so first things first, when food gets down in your stomach, you're going to secrete that gastrin. Gastrin is going to trigger you to secrete hydrochloric acid and enzymes. Hydrochloric acid is going to do a couple different things. It's going to, as I said before, kill any pathogens, and it's going to help to denature proteins, to unravel proteins so it's easier for your enzymes to access them and break them apart. And what enzymes do we have that break proteins apart? Well, pepsin. So pepsin, as I said before, is pretty much an all-purpose protein hydrolysis enzyme. Lipases, on the other hand, are triggered, their secretion is also triggered by gastrin, but they hydrolyze fat instead. Notice here that we are breaking down molecules, but we are not moving them into the bloodstream here. We're not doing any absorption of these molecules. Not yet. By the way, this YouTube link down here, highly, highly recommend it. I know usually I point to YouTube links and I'm like, oh, you know, whatever. It's cool. Watch it if you got time. This one, watch it. Okay? In fact, I would watch it with you, except I don't have internet access right now. So just go watch it, guys. It's really cool, and it's really kind of gross too. Okay, here's laying out that bit about gastrin and hydrochloric acid and enzymes and all that. So we said that those enteroendocrine cells, they secrete gastrin. It's the gastrin that triggers the release of these enzymes and HCl. What causes us to release gastrin? Well, food in the stomach. How do we know there's food in the stomach? Well, when we get food down there, what it'll do is it'll actually raise the pH of the stomach. We do have a little bit of acid in there at all times, even if we're not actively digesting things. So if we get some food in there, we're going to raise the pH. Remember, when we're really acidic, we have a really, really low pH, and when we raise the pH, we're neutralizing some of the acid a little bit. Namely, it's proteins, by the way, that do the acid neutralization. Proteins are a pretty good buffer for what it's worth. So those enteroendocrine cells will detect the the higher pH, and they're going to release their gastrin, and the gastrin is going to go trigger the release of hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes by those parietal cells and chief cells. And you know what's kind of cool? Where do we get the chlorine from? Well, the chlorine, as part of hydrochloric acid, is taken from our blood. Remember when we were talking about how we transport oxygen and CO2, and we said that there was something called a chloride shift, right, when we were buffering hemoglobin? Well, we're bringing back that chloride again. So we draw that chloride from the blood plasma, and that causes something called an alkaline tide in the blood during hydrochloric acid secretion. You got to be really, really careful if you're measuring arterial blood gases in a patient who has just eaten because of this alkaline tide. Okay, so let's look at how fast our stomach empties. And hold on just one sec, guys. Okay, sorry for the interruption again, guys. My dog walked in and wanted attention. Okay, let's look at what determines how fast we empty our stomach. By the way, I have a little fun fact over here. We move about 3 milliliters of fluid at a time from our stomach into the small intestine. And the way we move it is kind of like through squirting through that pyloric valve at the very bottom of our stomach. So obviously, if we fill our stomach full of food, it's going to take it longer for it to fully empty. So volume is a big factor. Another factor is osmotic pressure. If we move a non-isotonic solution, and by non-isotonic solution I mean a fluid, soda, lemonade, something like that, that is not the same osmolarity as our blood. So soda does not have the same amount of ions as our blood. Lemonade does not have the same amount of ions as our blood. What we have to do in our stomach is we have to adjust the osmolarity so that it is the same amount as our blood before we can move it into the small intestine. The further away from our blood that we are, the longer it's going to take to adjust the osmolarity. So things like soda and lemonade are going to stay in your stomach for quite a while. Chemical composition is also going to play a pretty big role, specifically fat. So digestion of fat by those lipases decreases motility. Food stays in your stomach longer when it's full of fat. And the reason why is because when we move that fat into the small intestine, we actually do not have any enzymes in the small intestine that are capable of further digesting the fat by themselves. We have to get help from the liver and from the pancreas. So we have to match the movement of fat into our small intestine to the secretions by our liver and pancreas. So the higher fat, the slower movement. This is why high-fat foods, this is part of the reason why we think high-fat foods make you feel full for longer. And this right here, this is just fun. Why do you get drunk faster on an empty stomach? Those of you guys who had to get your bartender's license, you know this. In fact, you probably had to learn about all about the pyloric valve and whatnot. So again, not required, but just cool. Now for the even cooler stuff, stomach pathology. What goes wrong? Let's look at ulcers and GERD here on this slide. Ulcers are erosions of the stomach wall. And when we say stomach wall, we don't really mean that we totally erode a hole in the stomach. We're just usually removing the mucus layer or even down to the submucosal layer. It's very, very rare to just get a full-on hole in the stomach. What are the symptoms of it? Well, severe gnawing pain. When I say gnawing pain, it feels like something is eating you from the inside out, and it's actually slightly above the stomach, almost where the lungs are. That's because of referred pain, if you remember that from spinal nerves and whatnot. What causes it? We used to think, up until quite recently, we used to think that it was stress that caused ulcers. We used to think that it was certain foods that caused most ulcers. But as it turns out, it's a bacterial infection, specifically by this bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. And what it does is it nestles itself into those folds of your stomach, and it destroys the protective mucus coating of the stomach. And by destroying the protective mucus coating, your stomach can then start digesting itself and eroding its own wall. And in fact, the guy who proved that it was that most stomach ulcers are caused by H. pylori, here's a picture of him down here at the bottom. His name was Barry Marshall. He was a really, really brave man. He proved this by drinking a sample of H. pylori and giving himself a stomach ulcer. So, really put his money where his mouth was. He actually cured himself by giving himself a course of antibiotics a couple days later, and he won the Nobel Prize for it. Okay. Another common stomach pathology is gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD, also known as heartburn. This occurs when stomach acid splashes back up into the esophagus where we do not have that protective mucus coating, and we can really feel it when it happens. It feels like burning, and it feels like, and where it happens is right at the cardia of the, or rather right at the bottom of the esophagus, so right kind of where the cardia of the stomach is, and therefore right where the heart is. That's why it's called heartburn. And it feels like burning pain right behind the sternum. And this is very, very different from the pain generated by a heart attack, by the way. This is more like burning deep pain. A heart attack is very, very, when you do feel pain with heart attacks, it's more like electricity zapping you. So what can cause this? Well, most of the time it's a little too much weight. So if you're a little overweight, you can build up a little bit too much fat in the abdominal area, and that actually presses open the lower esophageal sphincter, especially when you're laying down. You can also get it when you're eating or drinking a whole lot, so you're making a whole lot of stomach acid. Some of it can splash back up, or during running or intense exercise. So when you're running or doing intense exercise, again, some of the acid can splash back up. When I hear about some of these pathologies, I just think about the human body and how we even manage to survive sometimes, you know? We're so lame. Okay, that's it for the stomach. I'll meet you later for the small intestine.